Welcome to our first lecture of World History 1500 to the present. Now, we only have a few short weeks to cut through over 500 years of human history, so we're going to go at a fairly brisk pace. If you've read the announcement, which you all should do if you haven't, you'll note that we'll have between 2 and 3 lectures per week. The great thing for you is doing this online. You get to watch these at your leisure, but make sure you watch them all completely so that you can best answer the discussion post questions for the week. So we're going to start by talking about something known as the Columbian Exchange. Sometimes this is also known as the American Exchange, but what this refers to is the exchange of goods, people, diseases, food, once Europeans have made contact with peoples of the Americas. So today we're going to talk about first contact, well, I guess I should say first sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, how that plays out and why, and then we'll talk about what this Columbian Exchange is and how massively important it is to world history. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. Now, because we don't have a ton of time, we can't talk about every impressive empire in the Americas, so we're going to focus on the Aztecs. So the height of the Aztec Empire is between 1427 and 1521. And if you've taken any classes on Latin America, you probably know the history of the Aztecs in great detail. So here's just a few highlights. The Aztec Empire was incredibly large. The Aztecs ruled over about 19 million people. This was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Very impressive, very sophisticated. As you can see in the drawing based on the ruins of Aztec cities, this was a very, as I said, sophisticated society. I mean, they had city planners, they built out their cities very thoughtfully. And if you've ever been to the old part of a European city, you've definitely seen it. They could have used a city planner or two. So very sophisticated empire and very large, certainly larger than any European empire at this particular moment in history. Now, the Aztecs also had a professionalized army that was based on merit. And if you're a student of military history, you know that a merit-based army historically always does better than a non-merit-based army. So a merit-based army means that people move up in the ranks based on their merit, on their skill set. Who's the best at this job, they get to move up. Many armies throughout history that are not merit-based, that's usually where you buy your commission. You buy your way into an officer's position, and it really doesn't matter if you're good at the job, it's if you can purchase it. So having a professional army that's merit-based is very significant because it means you have better officers. So the professionalized merit-based army of the Aztecs is very efficient at building their empire. And the better their army is, the more the Aztecs expand their empire throughout what is today Mexico. Now, if you know anything about empires, you know anytime an empire expands, the people they conquer not traditionally happy about being conquered, and that's quite understandable, right? So the Aztec Empire by 1521 has expanded to an incredibly large reach. They've conquered a lot of people, and a lot of those people are really ticked off about this conquest. And so what that means is that when the Spanish come in 1521, they will find a lot of angry people in what is today Mexico who are more than happy to help the Spanish out because it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend mentality. So that's a little bit about the Aztecs. Like I said, we don't have time to go into a tremendous amount of detail. But the next question we need to answer is why in the world do Europeans decide to do this, right? Europeans have mostly just been sitting at home, right? Not exactly. We do know that the Vikings made it to North America, although they did not stick around. They went home. But Europeans had been interacting with large chunks of the world for a very, very long time. They had been traipsing along the Silk Road trade routes, which you can see on the map there, into the Middle East, into China for trade. But what begins to change all that is the Black Death, the bubonic plague, Y. pestis. When the Black Death at its height comes along in the 1340s, people realize, even though they don't understand germ theory yet, they realize that the disease seems to be traveling along the trade routes. Now, again, they don't understand germ theory. They don't understand yet how diseases travel. But they do recognize that the plague first turned up in China, and then you could track the infections along the Silk Road trade routes until they ultimately reached Europe. So they could figure that out. And so at the height of the Black Death, again in the 1340s, increasingly Europeans and the Chinese and Middle Eastern traders are all really concerned about trading along the trade routes. Now we know how this happened was infected fleas got on rats, basically hopped a ride on rats, and then rats were a very common sort of companion at this point in history. And then rats come into contact with humans, the lice jump off the rats, bite a human, regurgitate their infected saliva into the human, and then you have the Black Death. So that's the scientific way that this happened. They don't understand that, but they do know something is happening. So everybody starts to get really concerned about the Silk Road, and people stop using it very much. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but China, for this period of history, and in fact up to the 19th century, was really the economic hub of world trade. Everybody wanted stuff from China, stuff from India. China had the best stuff. And so the Europeans feel nervous about using the Silk Roads, but they also still want stuff from China. So they don't want to give up all those good luxury items, but they don't want to do it through the Silk Road trade route. So they look elsewhere and they try to figure out, how can we get to China by sea? Also, the Europeans are hoping to bypass the middlemen of Middle Eastern traders who would oftentimes buy goods from China and then turn around and sell them to Europeans at a markup cost, which is kind of what a middleman does. So trying to find a sea route is so that they can trade with China is the biggest reason that they sort of set sail across the ocean trying to find this route. Ultimately, this is about a desire for wealth. And also Europeans are hoping that they might be able to unseat China as the dominating economic power. They want stuff from China. They want tea in particular, porcelain, silk, spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper. I mean, at this point, European food was really bland. Really bland. You might have some salt, but you didn't even have pepper, which now today we just consider to be a standard spice that almost everybody has in their home. It's really inexpensive. But at the time, imagine, I know it's hard, but imagine that your food was incredibly tasteless. And then you add a little pepper, ooh, you're going to be willing to pay top dollar for that. Now imagine you can add cinnamon and nutmeg to your food. That's like a taste explosion if there ever was one. These items are so lucrative. A single small pouch of nutmeg was enough to buy an estate back in Europe. That's how lucrative these spices were. So Europeans are going, if we can get a corner on this trade, we can make a lot of money. And maybe, just maybe, unseat China as this dominating economic power. The problem at this point with that equation is that the Europeans have absolutely nothing that the Chinese want. Europeans weren't really making anything that great. Their clothing was largely made out of wool. The Chinese had silk. You can kind of see why they're not really interested so much in wool. Outside of that, Europeans didn't really have a lot of products that were in any way close to or even superior to Chinese products. So the problem here, and will continue to be for a little while, is that the Chinese are more than happy to sell stuff to the Europeans, but there's nothing they want to buy from the Europeans. So it continues to be a very unequal trade relationship for a while. Now, I'm sure you all know the story of Christopher Columbus setting sail 1492, first of his 4 voyages. Now, I'm sure you also know that Christopher Columbus was trying to get to India, or at the very least China. He was trying to hit one of them. And we kind of make fun of Columbus. Sometimes I think it's fair, sometimes maybe not. But we kind of make fun of him because, oh, what an idiot. How did he not know there were 2 continents between him and China? Well, in his defense, nobody in Europe really knew. I mean, again, the Vikings had made it to what is now Canada, but they hadn't really told a lot of people about that. And that was centuries beforehand. And Columbus found this map in an archive. And the map betrayed the world. But it didn't include North and Central and South America because the cartographer did not know. And so Columbus finds this map. He thinks it's the key. The map basically estimates that the world was about 3/4 of the size it actually is. Again, they're not accounting for 2 continents. So he takes this map and says, I know the way to sail across the ocean. To sail across the ocean and find China to create a direct sea route. Now, while he's doing this, Columbus is actually Italian, but he ends up sailing for the Spanish because no Italian monarchs are interested, but the Spanish are willing to take a chance on him. Now, the reason why he wants to go sort of directly across the ocean there is because the Portuguese had already begun to work their way down around Africa to ultimately end up in India. So that way kind of was already taken. So he's trying to find something new. Now, he ultimately ends up landing on what he called Hispaniola. He renamed it, but today it's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he doesn't find any gold. That's what they're hoping he's going to find. But it is clear to him very immediately he's not where he thought he was. And so this will inspire the Spanish monarchs to fund more trips to find out what else is there. And in 1521, a contingency of conquistadors led by Hernan Cortez arrive on the mainland of what is today Mexico. And they're the first Spanish to land there. Now they land, and I'm sure many of you know the story. They land. There's not many of them in comparison to the millions of, obviously, people who already live there. But as we'll see, there are some reasons why the Spanish will ultimately be successful in their conquest of the Aztecs, later the Incas, etc. Now, what happens is Cortez and his guys land on the beach. Word gets back to Montezuma II, who is the king of the Aztecs. He sends down sort of a welcoming party because in the Aztec religion, there is a legend about a god returning to earth, pale of face. And so Montezuma goes, okay, these guys are kind of pale of face. Maybe that's our god returned. We don't know. Let's not tick them off until we know for sure who they are. So they invite Cortez and his conquistadors into Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, for this big banquet. And partway through the banquet, the Spanish rise up and begin killing people at the banquet. They see how wealthy the empire is, and they want to steal all the gold and silver, etc., that they can find in the city. And this begins the fighting between the Spanish and the Aztecs. So why are the Spanish ultimately successful? Well, first of all, those Aztec religious beliefs. It is not Montezuma's fault, obviously, that he allowed them in, right? He's trying to be a good host. Also, not sure if this is a god returned to earth or not. Makes logical sense in that frame of reference that he would try to be welcoming. But it does allow Cortez and his men an inside view into the Aztec Empire, and then they, again, erupt from inside out. But they're also able to take advantage of the people who are mad at the Aztecs as they begin to build alliances with people who are really mad that the Aztecs have conquered them. And so those alliances prove really, really helpful because the Spanish don't know the terrain. They are not familiar with the plant life, what we can eat, what we can't. Cortez actually finds a translator, and to be honest, I'm not sure how that whole system worked, but she, I believe he called her Maria, she learns Spanish, and then she can translate for Cortez to the other groups of people he's trying to make alliances with, and that proves very, very helpful. Also, the Spanish have no compunction about murdering. They are willing to kill anyone and everyone as long as it comes between them and gaining more gold. So again, this is not about diplomacy, this is about wealth. And then lastly, but most importantly, disease is one of the main reasons the Spanish succeed. As we'll talk about more later in this lecture, the Spanish bring over with them, unintentionally, European diseases that the peoples of the Americas had never encountered before. And those diseases will lay waste to more people than the Spanish could ever have laid hands on. But again, we'll talk more about the role of disease later in the lecture. Now, the lessons that the Spanish come away with from their experience with the Aztecs, and this is something that will inform the way that they expand and conquer in Central and South America. And the first lesson is that to really conquer, they're gonna have to move quickly because they know they're the minority. There's not a lot of them. Now, they do have firearms for sure. I mean, we're not talking about anything crazy sophisticated by 2017 standards, but certainly for the time period, very sophisticated. And certainly the people of the Americas did not have firearms, so that definitely is impactful. But they still knew, even so, they were overwhelmed in numbers, so they felt that they had to go in quickly. They also came away with the lesson that they had to remove symbols of legitimate rule. So that meant killing any emperors, kings, government officials, anyone who could pose a significant threat to their power base. And so they will kill Montezuma. When they move to the Incan Empire, they will kill the Incan emperor as well. So this is, again, it sets a pattern for how they proceed throughout the rest of Central and South America. Now from here, they will build an incredibly large empire. It's a tributary empire, which means that all of these places pay tribute back to the Spanish king and queen. So the Spanish king and queen are getting very, very wealthy over the next few centuries as they send Spanish colonists send more and more goods, gold and silver back to the home country. And they will exploit the wealth of the indigenous peoples they encounter. They'll ransack the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire, etc. And once they've exhausted all the gold and silver and jewels they can find, then they start building gold and silver mines to extract more. And they will force the indigenous peoples into slavery to extract those items. Again, this is all about wealth and power. One of the reasons for this is that Europe in this period European states, I should say, were competing with each other. At this point in the early to mid 1500s, there was no clear dominating European power, but everybody wanted to be. And when Spain starts discovering all this gold and wealth in the Americas, that's when Britain and France, etc., start getting in on it and trying to gobble up whatever they can, because it's clear there's lots of resources in the Americas that will help them assert themselves as a dominating European power. So a lot of the way that the Americas are carved up and sort of digested by the Europeans is out of, again, this race for power and wealth within Europe. Now, this sustained contact between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, which is just a combined term to refer to Africa, Europe, and Asia, because those three continents had been in contact pretty much since human beings could wander about. This begins what's called the Columbian Exchange. This is, as you can see on the slide here, one of the most important exchanges in world history. This is the first sustained contact between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia. And the Columbian exchange refers to the exchange of people, goods, and ideas between these two spheres of the world. And this exchange of all these things will completely reshape the people, the environment, and the landscape of both the Americas and Afro-Eurasia. This is, again, one of the most important aspects of world history. So much of the way the world is today is because of this moment when these two hemispheres start interacting and trading things. Sometimes this results in good things. Oftentimes it comes down to very, very bad things, as we'll see. So there's a series of exchanges that we're going to talk about within this. And the first is germs and disease. So I already talked a little bit about how the Europeans brought in diseases that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had never seen before. And there were some diseases that both hemispheres shared. They all had dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, but those were the only ones that they shared. Now, the people of Africa, Europe, and Asia had all been exposed to many more diseases: smallpox, influenza, cholera, yellow fever, diphtheria, measles, and whooping cough, all of which you can die from. Luckily not today. Luckily all of these are treatable today, if not curable. So why do people in the Americas not have any experience with these diseases? Well, the short version of that story is human beings develop diseases based on their close contact with animals. This is a period when people would have lived indoors with their animals, with their cows and their chickens or whatever, during the winter especially. And so very close proximity between humans and animals. Now, the more domesticated animals you have, the more types, right? Chickens, goats, cows, whatever. The more of those domesticated animals you have, the more you're living with them, the more diseases you're going to have contact with. In the Americas, there are very few domesticated large animals. The horse had died out in the Americas several thousand years before the Spanish show up. So there's no horses, there's no cows. In Central and South America, you would have had llamas and alpacas. But if you have ever met a llama or an alpaca, they are not friendly and they are not domesticable animals, even though we certainly tried. You can kind of use them, but you can't ride them. They would have used their wool and things like that, but not quite the same thing. So you don't have a lot of animals, so thus you don't have a lot of contact between human and animals, thus you don't have a lot of diseases. So when the people from Europe come over, they have a certain amount of genetic resistance to these diseases. That's not to say that a European wouldn't die of smallpox or yellow fever or cholera, certainly not. But the more human beings' bodies experience diseases, the more we build up a resistance to them. That's sort of biology, right? That our bodies find a way to cope with it so that we can survive and not die the next time we come in contact with one of these diseases. So over many, many, many centuries, Europeans had developed a certain level of genetic resistance to all of these diseases. But that still means you can carry the disease even if you're not being affected by it. And that's what happened when they came to the Americas. They brought these diseases with them, again, unintentionally. They had no idea this is how this worked. But the people of the Americas, because they've never been exposed to smallpox or diphtheria, they have no genetic resistance. And so when these diseases come over, they will decimate indigenous populations across the Americas. For example, in 1492, when Columbus arrived on Hispaniola, again, Haiti, and then the other half of the island is the Dominican Republic, the population of the indigenous peoples there was 1 million. It's a lot of people, right? 10 years later, only 50,000 of those indigenous peoples remained. So within 10 years, I mean, think about that. They go from 1 million to 50,000. Now, true, some of those people would have died through direct violence from the Spanish, but the majority died from these diseases. I mean, again, people just go down for the count, die very quickly, because again, they have no genetic resistance. But this rate of death, what this means for the Spanish is two things. First of all, the Spanish think that God has saved them. That because the indigenous peoples are not Christian, that God has chosen them over the indigenous peoples. And this also makes conquest very easy. Disease is doing 99% of the work. There's fewer people. It's a lot easier for the Spanish to take charge. And it will happen once they go to the mainland as well. Here's some startling statistics on the impact of disease in the Americas. Prior to contact, there were between 40 and 70 million people living in the Americas total. By 1600, so less than a century after contact with the mainland, Mexico's population dropped from 25 million to 1 million. That is staggering. In the years between 1521, first contact, and 1600, you go from 25 million people to 1 million. Again, and it's all due to disease. The overall population of the Americas went from 40 to 70 million pre-contact to only 6 million by 1650. That is so important to understand, because there's no way that Europeans quote unquote conquer and colonize the Americas without this advantage of disease. Without disease killing so many of the people in the Americas, there is absolutely no way the Europeans could have done what they did. Just absolutely no way. They wouldn't have had the numbers. So again, disease, the most important factor in the Europeans conquering the Americas. Now here is an account from central Mexico 3 years after the Spanish arrived that recounts what this was like. So it's a great plague broke out here in Tenochtitlan. It lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could only lie in their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads. They could not lie face down or roll from one side to the other. If they did move their bodies, they screamed with pain. A great many died from this plague, and many others died of hunger. They could not get up to search for food, and everyone else was too sick to care for them, so they starved in their beds. So many of these millions of people died from disease, but many others died from starvation, because that many people sick, you can't go out and work the farms, you can't grow food, you can't hunt. So between plague and starvation, we have these millions of deaths. And the thing was that this exchange of diseases, for the most part, didn't really go both ways. It was very unequal, and certainly wasn't as catastrophic going the other direction. The only serious disease that the Americas had that the Europeans did not have was syphilis. So that's the only disease that goes the other direction. After around 1500, Europeans started being more and more affected by syphilis for arguably the first time. Now, syphilis is a lot easier to prevent than smallpox, because Europeans understood sexually transmitted diseases. So they understood that syphilis was a result of sexual contact. Again, a lot easier to prevent than, say, smallpox, which they didn't really understand how that was transmitted. Now, with this discussion of diseases, it's very important to think about this has huge ramifications. First of all, it's the major factor in European success in colonizing the Americas. also think about the fact that disease spreads far, far ahead of the European. So someone could die from a European disease and never have even met a European, right? Disease can travel so much faster than we even realize. But it also meant that it decimated the population of the Americas. And the Spanish in particular were really keen to use the indigenous peoples as slave labor to extract silver and gold. But these people kept dying due to European diseases. And that is one of the reasons that the Europeans will turn to importing African slaves to do this work. So they do attempt to enslave the indigenous peoples first. When they continue to die, they import African slaves because African slaves have the same amount of genetic resistance to these diseases that the Europeans do. So they're going to die in fewer numbers than the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Disease will also be a factor in the conversions of many indigenous peoples to Christianity, specifically to Catholicism, which the Spanish bring with them to Latin America. As the diseases wipe out so many indigenous peoples, the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries, are saying, we Spanish Europeans aren't dying. Maybe there's something to that. And the indigenous peoples, not all of them, but many of them do look at that and say, maybe they're right. Maybe their God is protecting them more than our gods are protecting us. And so you do see the conversion of many indigenous peoples to Christianity, Catholicism in particular, as a way to stop the disease from affecting them and their family members. So here is a map of the exchange. Again, you can see we'll talk more in a minute about food, but I think it's nice to have a visual of what's going where. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is food. First, we're going to talk about what goes from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia. Now, the most important food, this is huge, to go from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia are potatoes. I know, it's weird to think that Ireland did not have potatoes until after contact with the Americas, because we so much associate Ireland with potatoes. Potatoes really grew well in Peru, many different varieties of potatoes. And the Europeans see how easy it is. Potatoes can grow in a lot of different kinds of soil. They're very, very hardy growers. Potatoes can also produce 4 times the yield of other crops. So you can have a small field and plant potatoes, which yield a lot of food, or you can plant wheat, which doesn't really yield as much. So a lot of Europeans will import potatoes and start growing them because they yield so much. So even if you have a small farm, you can grow a lot of food. Also, potatoes are nearly nutritionally complete. You can actually live off potatoes. They have pretty much, well, I should say almost as many vitamins as you need to survive. If you've seen that movie The Martian with Matt Damon where he gets stuck on Mars, this is what he grows. He grows potatoes for this exact same reason. They're hardy, they grow easily, and you can survive on them without having serious health impacts. Potatoes are so important to Europe because they're easy to grow, they're so nutritionally complete. It actually means that the European population is going to skyrocket because people are eating better. They're having more access to this very good food. So that's sort of the irony of the Columbian Exchange, is that European diseases wipe out millions of people in the Americas. American food in the form of potatoes goes to Europe and actually creates a population boom. Huge irony. But potatoes are not the only food that goes from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia. You also have corn. Now, this is not as pervasive as potatoes, but you do see corn being imported and grown in Europe. Other foods are things like zucchini, peanuts, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies. It's also crazy to think about Italian food without the tomato, but they didn't have tomatoes until the 1500s. And that's one fascinating thing I think about this, is that This new food completely transforms the cooking cultures of European countries. I mean, again, what is Italian food without tomatoes? What is Ireland without the potato? Again, completely revolutionizes the way these countries cook various different kinds of food. Now, some other food items that go from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia are caffeine and sugar. Now, sugar had been produced before this on a couple of Mediterranean islands, but it was very, very expensive. Very few people would have been able to afford it. And eventually the soil was they tried to produce too much and the soil was really worn out. The Portuguese began building sugar plantations on some of the islands off the west coast of Africa. But once they get to the Caribbean and to what is now Brazil, they begin building sugar plantations like crazy. And we'll talk about sugar plantations more when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade. But the more sugar they produce, the more people want it. Again, try to imagine your life without sugar. I mean, it's in everything, right? We're at a point where we're trying to cut out sugar. It's not something Europeans would have thought about at this particular moment. And think about if you'd never had it. Think about how amazing sugar would taste. So yeah, people want it. There's a lot of money to be made in sugar plantations. Couple that with the fact that they also discover cocoa beans in the Americas. So you take some cocoa beans, you add a little sugar, you've got chocolate. And this is pretty much a most exciting discovery. Chocolate still would have been very expensive, so predominantly the wealthy would have been able to afford it. But you also see the invention of hot chocolate as a beverage, which they adapt from indigenous drinks of the Americas. But what's really fascinating and weird to me is that these various drinks become assigned a gender, which is kind of weird. Like hot chocolate becomes known as a woman's drink, and men in Europe were not really to drink hot chocolate. That was not the case in the Americas, but it's so fascinating and weird to me that the Europeans were like, yep, beverages can only be for certain genders. I mean, it's just kind of weird. Now, coffee was seen as a manly drink. They also are getting coffee from the Americas. You see the opening of coffee houses. So Starbucks and other coffee shops are not new. They've existed since really the 1600s in various iterations. But coffee houses would have been for men only. Women would not have been welcome. And this would have been a place where you'd go, you'd have your coffee, you'd read over the newspaper, you'd have a chat with people there about the news of the day. Not so dissimilar from many coffee houses today, although I suppose we've replaced the discussion with being on our laptops or our phones, but still the concept's still there. Now, they're also still importing a lot of tea from China, but now they have sugar to put in the tea, so woohoo, this is very exciting. But tea was interestingly a drink that was okay for men and women. So again, I find this so fascinating how drinks become assigned to gender. It's a bit crazy to think about. I don't know, I think drink whatever you like, but that was not the opinion in the 1600s. We also get tobacco coming over from the Americas. Now, in the Americas, tobacco was used for ritualistic purposes. But the Europeans smoked it and they really liked it. Tobacco at the time had a lot more physiological and psychedelic effects. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe you'd be seeing stuff when you smoked it, but it was definitely very different than tobacco today, which is why the people of the Americas used it for rituals. It was part of a religious ceremony. But for the Europeans, they really liked it for a recreational use, so they begin smoking it because they enjoy the feeling of it. Now, one thing that's really fascinating to me about this is that already by the early 1600s, so many people in England were smoking tobacco that King James I wrote a treatise on how nasty and bad for you it was. So in 1604, we have the very first anti-smoking campaign. Now, it doesn't work, nobody listens to him, but he was on the right track. As we now know, it's incredibly harmful to your health. And there were already people as early as 1604 saying, hey, maybe we should be careful about this. Now, food going the other direction from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. As European colonists come to the Americas to settle, they bring seeds from home so that they can plant it in their new colonies to make things feel a little bit more familiar. So they're the ones that bring apples, cherries, spinach, all the other ones you see there. None of those were indigenous to the Americas, although all of them grow very well here. Well, in parts of the Americas, I should say. Items they brought for profit were sugarcane. That was not indigenous to the Americas, although it grows very well, especially in the Caribbean. They also brought wheat and bananas. Bananas were more from Africa, but they bring over bananas, and they also grow very, very well in Latin America. So all three of those were brought to make money, sugarcane making the most money of all of them. Now, the Europeans also brought some non-food plants on accident. They did bring the dandelion. So if you've ever had to weed your yard or bemoan the many dandelions in your yard, you can thank Europeans in the 15 and 1600s. Again, they don't intentionally bring this, but as I'm sure you know, dandelions kind of go wherever they want. And so they kind of hitch a ride on boats over to the Americas. But as all invasive species do, especially when they're a non-native plant, the dandelion grows very, very well and, again, spreads crazy quickly. So now from food to animals. So animals that go from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. One of the most important exchanges of animals was the importation of horses, especially by the Spanish as early as the 1520s. Importing horses produced a fundamental transformation of life for many indigenous groups, quite quickly, just by the late 1600s. As I said earlier, horses died out, indigenous horses died out several millennia earlier. So one thing we forget, because we see a lot of movies about the Wild West period in the United States in particular, and we assume that Native American tribes were always riding around on horses, chasing down bison, living a nomadic lifestyle. But that wasn't always true. Prior to the reintroduction of the horse, many Native American tribes, especially in North America, lived a sedentary life. Many of them had villages. They were permanent dwellings. And it's only when the horses are reintroduced that Native American tribes in the U.S. begin to readapt to a mobile lifestyle where they can follow the bison, because horses make it much easier to hunt bison. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a bison in real life, but they are huge, absolutely huge, a bit terrifying in how big they are. And so I can't imagine trying to take these things on without even a horse. Even on a horse, I don't think I'd be on board. But horses completely transform the Native American way of life, particularly in North America. With horses, they're able to follow the bison herds year-round. This is where you see them developing teepees, mobile living units. This is absolutely fundamental to a shift in Native American culture, as I said, especially in North America. Now, Europeans also bring other animals. They bring pigs, sheep, and dogs, all of which, many of them get loose, just like the horses actually. Some of them become wild, especially the pigs. Because pigs were not a native species, when they did get free, they had no natural predators, although eventually predators do come to start eating them. But for a while, they have no natural predators. So these pigs grow to be just gigantic and arguably terrifying from the accounts I've read of the time period. But again, just like the dandelion, when you introduce a new species to an environment, it can do a lot of damage. And all three of these wreaked havoc on the ecosystems that they were introduced to. Now, one of the most important exchanges within the Columbian exchange is silver. And this goes from the Americas to Eurasia. Now, as I said, the Spanish see all this silver and gold in the Aztec Empire throughout Latin America, And once they've sort of stolen up, snatched up all of this that's already been pulled out of the ground, they begin building silver mines to send more, because silver is something the Chinese want. So finally, the Europeans, well, the Spanish in particular, have something that China wants. Now, in 1545, they opened a hugely rich mine in the Andes Mountains called Potosi, which is in present-day Bolivia. And the mining of this was so huge that in the first 150 years, they were pulling out 25,000 to 35,000 tons of silver and sending it to Spain every year. For 150 years, that's so much silver. But again, this makes the Spanish very wealthy and also very interesting to the Chinese. In Europe, so much silver enriched Spain, but it also led to increasing rivalries and wars between them and other European states who were arguably jealous. Now, in the rest of the world, it became clear that the Spanish now had something that everybody wanted, from kingdoms in India to the Chinese. But until 1571, to transport silver was really a pain because it's really heavy. And you're trying to do this on ships, and you don't want the ships to sink. So what the Spanish do is they say it's a really, really long trip trying to go over to China. So in 1571, Spain captures Manila, the capital in the Philippines, as you can see here on the map, so that they have a base of operations to go to China to trade the silver. And they'll actually hold the Philippines from 1571 until the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century, so for a very long time. Now, the ships that transported the silver from the coast of Mexico over to Manila and then ultimately to China were known as the Manila galleons, and there's one pictured on the lower right there. Basically, the silver from the Americas established the Spanish as players on the world scene. But keep in mind that this doesn't mean the Europeans all of a sudden, pushed China out of its dominant position. Not at all. They still had to play by the powerful rules of China as well as India, and all the silver coming into the global market initially just made India and China richer because the Spanish would use it to buy soap, porcelain, etc. from China. So this was great for China, and they didn't have to do any of the heavy lifting to get this. But in the long run, silver from the Americas got the Europeans into the big game of economy and gave them an advantage they never would have had without access to the riches in the Americas. And they never would have had that access without diseases. So it's all connected.